So why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to all of you. We may have another couple people joining us. We are recording for the benefit of those who did not make it tonight, and I'll let those folks know by email probably tomorrow afternoon to let them know that Julie will have it up shortly. And for those I haven't met, I'm Steve Banowski. I'm the organizer for Denver Group Conservation. I've been in that position for a couple of years. I joined the club in June 1982. You can do the math. Makes me an official CMC fossil. And went to my first conservation meeting in July 1982 and have been rolling with it ever since. So we've got a really good panel tonight. I'll give a very quick overview, like 2 sentences for each one, and then let them chime in where they want. And Julie Mach, our conservation director, will be doing the moderating of that panel, handling questions. First up will be Jim Ramey. Jim is the state director, the Colorado State Director for the Wilderness Society. And before that, he also worked in energy. And he did send me a link to his online resume. Unfortunately, Jim, I ran short on time today, so I apologize for that. Next up will be Dr. Martha Marks from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Martha, I don't think she cares for the doctor term too much among her friends.
It's not the right kind of doctor, as my father would have said, so.
Martha,
you know what I mean.
Martha was the founder in 1995 of a radical group called Republicans for Environmental Protection when she was an elected county commissioner in Lake County in suburban Chicago. And I did check, Martha's doctorate degree is in Spanish, I believe, from Northwestern University. And so
I live in Santa Fe, so it's a perfect place to use it.
Yep, and Martha was the board chair of Conservatives for Responsible Stewardship, which was an educational offshoot of the old Republicans for Environmental Protection. And Martha is still on the board for that. Finally, we have Scott Braden from Grand Junction. Scott has his own consulting business as a stay-at-home dad called Lador Consulting. He's also a co-founder of a new group pushing for BLM Wilderness. Before that, he was wilderness advocate for Conservation Colorado. Before that, from 2011 to 2013, we were pleased to have him as conservation director in the Colorado Mountain Club. And before that, he worked for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance across the border. So at that, Julie, I will turn it over to you. And I think everybody knows what the format is, the program, and I'll let you monitor time and however you want to deal with that. So with that, Julie, I'll shut up.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and thanks everybody for being here this evening. For those I don't know, I'm Julie Mach. I'm the Conservation Director for CMC. I'm based down in Salida, but obviously working statewide on advocacy and stewardship issues. Really excited to have these 3 speakers here tonight to talk with us a little bit about politics as it relates to conservation and public land protection, and particularly speaking about opportunities for bipartisanship at the local, state, and national level. And so I'm going to let them do the majority of the talking. We sent them some kind of prompts and initial questions. And so I think we'll maybe go through and have each person talk for 5 to 10 minutes and just giving maybe a little more background on your personal history working in the conservation field, and then how you see bipartisanship, it's been a long day, impacting conservation efforts kind of in your realm and in your scope of work. We will open it up for questions from the audience at the end of our kind of 3 speakers. So if you're thinking of questions while we're going along, you can pop those into the chat, and we'll make sure to go back and get them all answered. So Scott, if you're good with me starting with you, I'll kick it over. And I think we had asked you to kind of speak to the statewide perspective on bipartisanship. And yeah, I'll let you take it from here. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Julie, and it's good to be here tonight. I hope everybody is doing well. So a little bit about me. As folks, Steve pointed out in his kind introduction, I'm based in Grand Junction. And I run an organization called the Colorado Wildlands Project, and we work on protecting Colorado's 8 or so million acres of managed public lands. We're kind of a new organization in that we've only been in existence since about November or so. So me and my co-founder, Julie Slivka, started it then. We work on kind of parallel tracks to build support for protecting BLM wildlands, both administratively, so kind of doing the work of monitoring projects that the BLM might be undertaking, as well as making comments and trying to influence the shape of those projects, as well as building administrative protections and land use plans and other things like that. We also work to permanently protect public lands, and that can be in the case of creating more wilderness, national conservation areas, or national monuments. All of those things require grassroots support. So we work to build and bring different voices to that conversation to show that there's demand for conservation here on the western slope of Colorado. So that's a little bit about the Wildlands Project. To the theme tonight of whether or not bipartisanship is important in conserving public lands, I would argue that it has always been really important in Colorado and in Utah, which are the areas that I have the most expertise with. There's always going to be an element of partisanship to everything political, naturally, and the history of wilderness and public lands protection is no different, really. There's always been partisan tugs pulling the conversation in either direction, throughout the history of modern public lands protection. So you can never get rid of that partisanship entirely. The best is to kind of hope for a managed bipartisanship, I have found. So when I was thinking about kind of what to say that was sounded halfway intelligent about Utah and Colorado's history with this stuff, and I'll admit I'm no historian on this, but it was really struck at the level of bipartisanship that there's been over the years, from the very founding of the Wilderness Act in 1964, where our own representative here in Grand Junction, Wayne Aspinall, who was a Democrat, but played a role, kind of tugging it in a more conservative direction. And it's because of him that Congress adds to the wilderness system rather than just agency recommendations. So that's a point where sort of people tugging and adding appropriate tension for their own partisan objectives, in the end, I think made the Wilderness Act a more durable and a stronger system. Early in the history of Colorado wilderness, there were a lot of prominent Republicans that played important roles in early Colorado bills. Senator Peter Dominick, Senator Hank Brown played particularly notable roles. And over in the House, Representative Joel Heffley played an important role in the beginnings of the protection campaign for Browns Canyon that finally was realized as a national monument a few years back. And over in Utah, it's much the same. People think of Utah as a strictly Republican state, but as recently back as the 70s and the 60s, it was a fairly bipartisan state, although folks were fairly conservative on both sides of the aisle there. And, you had Democrats like Senator Frank Moss, playing an important role in the creation of Canyonlands National Park, and Republicans like Orrin Hatch playing an important role in creating new wilderness areas such as the High Uintas. And much more recently in both states, you've seen that bipartisanship play out, whether that be with the Emery County bill over in Utah a few years back, sponsored by a Republican House member whose name naturally I'm forgetting at the moment. Although Jim's gonna sit there, Martha or Jim's gonna save me, I can feel it. And also in Colorado, when I think back, recent history, Representative Scott Tipton in 2014 was important to passage of the Hermosa Creek Watershed Protection Act. So I thought, finally, I'd like to kind of talk about two sort of case studies that I think might be instructive here. And I apologize, it's getting dark where I am, and there's one paltry light in this room, so I might just get darker and darker here. So apologies if that's the case. I'll be soon like Steve in his basement dungeon. So one would be maybe the case of Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness here in Grand Junction. I think that that is a case, if I had to characterize it, was of appropriate bipartisan tension, where Black Ridge Canyons was this much sought after roadless area of BLM land west of Grand Junction and west of Colorado National Monument. And, for many, many years, people wanted to protect it. And there are different ways that it was discussed that might happen. And ultimately, a plan was sort of hatched to expand Colorado National Monument as a Park Service unit and take over those BLM lands to the west, all the way to the Utah border. And it came so far as Clinton Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, kind of openly suggesting that if Congress didn't get its act together, they were going to do that. And it really created the appropriate tension to leap across the partisan divide and have Representative Scott McInnes, along with Colorado senators at the time, to reach an alternative means of conservation for that area. And they succeeded. And today, one of the things that we're most proud of in Grand Junction is the National Conservation Area that was created, that was named Colorado Canyons National Conservation Area, later renamed the McInnes Canyons after the congressman, as well as the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness, protecting about 75,000 acres of truly exemplary public lands. The second case study I would suggest for folks is, if that one was appropriate tension being created by, partisan tension that led to a bipartisan outcome. There's other models, which is sort of like the something for everybody model, where you're meeting the needs of people on both ends of the spectrum. And in this case, I already mentioned the 2014 Hermosa Creek watershed legislation, where Congressman Scott Tipton was the House sponsor, and Senator Udall was the Senate lead, I believe. Again, looking at Jem there, I need to be corrected, but I believe it was Udall. And then maybe Bennett helped finish that one. And in that one, you were able to bring disparate interests together from the watershed and river community, from the OHV community, from the wilderness conservation community, and meet the needs of a pretty disparate and broad group of folks in a way that created space for a bipartisan deal. So that, I think, is a good place to end, and I am looking forward to answering questions.
Great. Thanks, Scott. That was perfect on time. And yeah, great information. Appreciate those key, really helps kind of consolidate the idea in people's head. So if folks have questions for Scott, go ahead. You can put them in the chat or write them down for later, and we'll circle back around. I think I'll pass it to Jim next, and Jim can speak to some of the same topics, but maybe on a broader national scale.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And Scott, you were looking for Representative Curtis for the Emery County bill, which, outside of Colorado, so a little bit outside of my expertise, but I got your back. Thanks everyone for having me. Again, Jim Ramey with the Wilderness Society. I'm fortunate to be the state director for Colorado. Have been with the Wilderness Society about 5 years now. And as Steve said earlier, worked on our energy and climate team before switching over to the state director role. And like a majority of Coloradans these days, I'm a transplant. I didn't grow up here. I grew up in Ohio on the east side of Cleveland. And growing up as a kid, had no idea what federal public lands were or were like. And remember vividly my first trips to the West and coming to Telluride and Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons and fallen in love with these places. So feel very fortunate to get to work on these issues day in and day out. And before the Wilderness Society, I actually lived over closer to Scott's neck of the woods down in Montrose, south of Grand Junction. Feel very fortunate that I got to spend time out on the Western Slope in rural Colorado before coming to the Front Range. So I'm guessing many of you know the Wilderness Society, but for those who may not, we've been around a little while now. We were founded in 1935, and we've been at the forefront of nearly every single major victory for our public lands in our country's history. And now I think the tally is at about 110 million acres of wilderness across 44 states. And our mission just got a light facelift. We just updated it to unite people to protect America's wild places just a couple months ago here. And as part of achieving our mission, we believe it's invaluable to have good working relationships with everybody, regardless of political party or ideology. And as evidence of that, when I got the state director job, my first trip back to Washington, over a 2-day period, I met with every single one of the 9 congressional offices for Colorado, Republican, Democrat alike. It was a really busy and exhausting 2 days, but it was incredibly beneficial and helpful experience to help to grow those relationships with all of the offices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the national perspective on the importance of bipartisanship for public lands conservation. And I can't help but give it a little bit of a Colorado flavor because that's most of what I do. But the big takeaway for me thinking about this, and I'm going to look at more recent history, the last 10, 12 years. If you look at the biggest victories that we've achieved for conservation, they've all been the result of incredible bipartisan support in Congress, both in the Senate and the House. That's how you get really big stuff done. You get big bipartisan majorities to pass things. And I'm going to give a couple relatively quick hit case studies to just reinforce that point, going in reverse chronological order. Just to a handful of months ago, in late 2020, the Great American Outdoors Act, which provided permanent full funding to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which many have exclaimed as our country's most successful conservation program, and then provided, I think it was about $5.5 billion to address the National Park Service and other federal agency maintenance backlogs. That passed by overwhelming majorities in both the House and the Senate. In the Senate, the vote was 73-25, incredibly strong support. Going back the year prior, the John Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act passed in 2019. Huge public lands victory, 2 million acres of new protections, hundreds of miles for wild and scenic rivers. Passed the House 363-62, passed the Senate 92-8, 92-8, overwhelming. Scott mentioned Hermosa Creek back in the 2015 National Defense Authorization Act. That defense authorization bill protected about 250,000 acres of wilderness. Not just Hermosa Creek, there were some other places too, including the Rocky Mountain Front in Montana. Again, overwhelming support from both parties in the Senate, 89-11. And then just lastly, going back to 2009, the beginning of President Obama's term, there was the Omnibus Public Land Management Act, and that was, again, about 2 million acres of new protections. Rocky Mountain National Park is wilderness in Colorado. Again, overwhelming majorities. And if you look at that and contrast it with, for those of you who were on from the very beginning of the call, Steve mentioned the big exciting news from last week, which I don't think Julie hit on in the introduction. But last Friday, the United States House of Representatives, in one of their first pieces of legislation that they passed this Congress, decided to take up public lands and wilderness, and they passed the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act to provide upwards of 3 million acres of protections, about 1 million acres in Colorado, 1 million acres around the Grand Canyon, some additional places in California and Washington state. And they passed that. The vote was a little closer than some of those examples I just mentioned a moment ago. It was 227 to 200. 8 Republicans joined in support. But it gets at why those other packages were successful, and we haven't yet been successful with these efforts that just got the vote on Friday in the House. When you get to the Senate, assuming that either the filibuster still exists, which we'll see what happens, but based on right now, it seems like it's sticking around, which means you got to get to 60 votes. You got to give Republicans something to vote for. All of those other packages had strong Republican support for different pieces of them. And the package that passed the House on Friday didn't. It didn't yet. So we'll see what happens in the Senate as things continue to move forward. And we'll look forward to working with folks and senators all across the country, specifically those on the Senate Energy Natural Resources Committee, on what ideas they might have that could be viable to pair with some of these great ideas from Colorado and Arizona and California and Washington. And hopefully we'll get it done. So I think I'm well under time, but I'll stop there, and very much looking forward to questions and discussion after we get through Martha's presentation.
Great, thanks, Jim. Yeah, that was an excellent overview, and I appreciate you plugging the recent Protecting America's Wilderness Act, and hopefully people were paying attention because we've got a little trivia on that later. So hopefully you're listening. Yeah, so that we'll pass it over to Martha to give us a little bit more perspective from maybe the other side of the aisle. And Martha, you're muted.
Okay,
There you go.
thank you. Yeah, I'm very interested in what you have to say. I love Colorado. I live in New Mexico, but I get up there a lot. I have a little yellow teardrop camper that I call Chiquita. And Chiquita and I are going to head up to Colorado the first 2 weeks of May. The last time I was there was about 2 years ago, and I had a marvelous time, first time ever at Colorado National Monument in Grand Junction. Just loved it. And I'm also a devotee of Alamosa National Wildlife Refuge. I'm a wildlife photographer, and it doesn't get any better anywhere than Alamosa. So I'm up there with you in spirit, and I'll be physically there in a couple of months. I also want to put in a plug. I'm a big fan of the Wilderness Society and the Wilderness Act, and I wanted to put in a little partisan plug for Congressman John Saylor. And you guys may or may not have ever heard of him, but in the middle 60s, he was known as St. John. He's a Republican congressman, as conservative as you could possibly hope to find, but he was the driving Republican force behind the Wilderness Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And the conservationists of his time called him St. John. He was such a force for nature. And Lord love people like that. There used to be Republicans like that, and we need to have more of them now. I'm going to put in a little comment. Pardon my reflection off my glasses. I can see it, but I can either stare blindly at the screen and not be able to read my notes, or I have to put a reflection on the screen. So sorry about that. If Steve says he's a fossil, I'm an even older fossil. I think I got 4 or 5 years on Steve. And just to put my life in context, because my life parallels on environmental issues the Republican Party. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life, because it tracks perfectly with what the Republican Party has done in this time. I'm going to be 75 this summer, and I have given a full third of my life to the cause of Republican environmentalism, conservation, you name it. It's hard to see where that was valuable, what the point was, but there are some things that one could point to that it was a useful project. I grew up in a Republican family. My father was a country boy, like most of them were in those days. He was a farm kid. He did graduate from college in the middle of the 30s, as did my mother, which is rare in those days. They met later, but my father made his career in the Army. because he couldn't get a job as an electrical engineer when he came out of college. So he served in World War II and in Korea. I am a first-year baby boomer, which dates me. And my father was actually in Korea when I was born in 46. He was there twice. He came out of World War II, went to Korea. They had me, and he went back to Korea, went to Germany. He was all over the place. But he would never have called himself an environmentalist. I'm not even sure he ever knew that word, but he was a conservationist. He was a naturalist. He called himself a TR Republican, and he was about as good a naturalist, lover of nature as you could want. And he is what created me. A lot of my mother came from other things, and me came from my mother, bookishness, music and things, but my father's gift to me was love of nature. I grew up traveling the USA, and this is my first earliest memories, in the 50s. We moved every single year, and not little short moves. They were cross country, Georgia to California to New York to New England to Texas. And those were in non-air conditioned cars on pre-interstate roads. So, and I was an only child. So I'd be in the back seat of the Ford, because it was always a Ford. And about every 2 hours, my father would say, "Time for a walk." And that was the excuse to get out. Anytime he found a natural area, sometimes it was a national park. Sometimes it was just some old farm field. Sometimes it was just whatever trees were along the side of the road. But we would get out, and whatever my mother would do, she'd probably stretch. But my father and I would go walking in the woods or on the prairie or alongside the river. And he knew the trees, he knew the bugs, he knew the critters, he knew whatever was there for some amazing thing. So he, to me, is what Republican environmentalism used to be. They cared about it. They cared about the land. They cared about the creatures. They understood the relationship between all these interrelated factors that we have to deal with. But he was not an environmentalist. I think he probably died before that even became a thing, a popular thing. But anyway, he's the reason I am what I am. And I registered to vote in 1968. I was had just turned 22. You had to be 21 in those days. And of course, I registered as a Republican. What else would I have registered at? But I was never very political, except I loved nature. I became a wildlife photographer in my middle 30s and through the 30s and 40s, and I still do that. That's what I do up at Alamosa and Grand Junction. I just love being out in nature, and I love making beautiful images of the things that I see, the things I love. I set out to have an academic career, and I did. I did get a PhD at Spanish in Northwestern, and I taught there for a long time. I ran the Spanish and Portuguese program for a long, long time. I published 3 series of college Spanish textbooks during about a 20-year career, and I finally just got tired. And so I got tired of it, and I set off to do other things. I retired early. I began writing fiction, which was fun. And my husband and I lived in a rather far up northern, north of Chicago suburb called Riverwoods, which tells you what it was. Riverwoods and the county that it's in, Lake County, is the county north of Cook County, which is where Chicago is. So it's Cook County, Lake County, and Wisconsin. Very natural areas. It's where the mafiosi used to go and have their little cabins in the woods in the teens and the 20s. Before they were wiped out. But we went up there because it was lovely. We bought an old house in the woods. It was as pretty as it could be. But we were on the cutting edge of Chicago sprawl. This is in the middle 80s. Chicago was coming, and there was no stopping it. And you could see every single farm field or prairie or riparian area, one after the other. They were rolling through with the bulldozers. The government of our county was run by a man named Robert Depke. Nobody really knew him as Robert Depke. His nickname, very well known, was Bulldozer Bob. And Bulldozer Bob and his buddies ran the county, and there was no stopping the sprawl. So after about 5 years of my bucolic writing life, I got involved in local politics on land use issues. In 1991-92, I ran for an open seat on our county board. I had no political experience. I didn't know what a precinct was. I took on an incumbent, and my husband, Lord Lovin, who knew me very well, said, "Poor man, he's not going to know what hit him." And this was in the Republican primary in 1992. He was established. I was a nobody, but I was a woman with a mission. I got 72% of the Republican vote in the primary and kicked the guy out of office. And then I went on to win the general election. I had people coming up to me, Democrats coming up to me for years afterwards, saying, "Martha, you're the only Republican I've ever voted for in my life, and I will vote for you forever." I had 3 terms, 12 years. During that time, I helped recruit other Green Republicans, and there are a lot of them out there. That was the time when it was kind of easy to stand up and be a Green Republican. And eventually we took over our county board. We kicked the bulldozer people out of office and basically set on a land acquisition program that by now, and this is now 30 years on, but the county has about 35,000 acres in its protection. That's a lot for a county. We passed something like $160 million in bond referenda to buy land. We bought it, we restored it, we opened it up to the public with trails. It pulls along the river corridors, and it connects the entire county now. They've done a lot since I left. I left in the early aughts, but it is a real amenity, and everybody knows it. And so that's one of the best things. If you ever hear about Lake County, you'll hear about the Lake County Forest Preserve District, because it's wonderful. Chicago area, all of Illinois has a potential where the county boards can also be forest preserve boards, and all Cook County and all the collar counties all have them. We were on a roll, on a tear through the 90s, and we bought a lot of land with great support from the public. In the middle of that time, in 1995, and this is where Steve and I start to connect. In 1995, seeing that we had a lot of success in Lake County as green gopers, as I called us, Green Republicans, I was one of a small group of women, actually it was all 3 women, who met at a Defenders of Wildlife conference in Maryland in the spring of 1995. We said there's a need for a Republican environmental organization. We don't need another Sierra Club. Republicans are all over the Sierra Club, but nobody knows we're there. We're all in the Wilderness Society. We're all in the Audubon Society, but we get lost because we don't stand up and say, "Hey, I'm a Republican." So everybody thinks Republicans don't care about these issues. And at the time, that's what people thought then. It's even more difficult now to imagine. But we started Republicans for Environmental Protection, or REP, in 1995. I ran it as an unpaid volunteer president until I retired at the end of 2008. So it was about 13, 14 years. I like to call it the world's funniest oxymoron, Republicans for Environmental Protection, but it didn't used to be. And the middle 90s, the reason we started REP, one reason was in reaction to Newt Gingrich and his contract on America, or contract with America. And it was starting to go the other way. The Republican Party of my family, the Republican Party that I had known mostly growing up, I think obviously we know the Reagan years began to sort of pivot, but by the 90s, you had, it was going in even a worse direction. And by the time we got to the aughts, it was getting worse. And then along came the Tea Party, and we all know what's happened. But I ran that for about 13, 14 years. And until I retired. It still exists. It has a different name, different people. It's not doing the things that we set out to do, but we can't complain when we leave something behind, right? So last summer, a few of us got together, a few of the old, we're all gray hairs now, but a few of the originals said, boy, we know we really need REP back. We need something like REP again, because it was a genuine Republicans for Environmental Protection. You can't get more clear about what you are and what you're about than that. So last summer we started it. And Steve, I had told you not to get too much into this, but I'm going to say this. We have it set up again. We have 501c4 tax status, which is what the original one had. We have the name Republicans for Environmental Protection back. We have the rep.org website. And a website built there. And legally, Rep is back. What's not back, and what the difficulty for me is that the Republican Party is not back. That's not, I don't think, anything resembling what we have today is nothing resembling, even when we were running Rep in the 90s and through the aughts. It's gone, as we all know, in an even more radical direction. So my problem is it's hard to be a Green Republican anymore. It's hard to even call myself a Republican anymore. I'm sure most of you can relate to that. It's hard to do that. And yet, what else does one do if one wants to bring back that kind of thread in the Republican Party? That the only way you can do is stand up and say that I'm one of these people, and maybe you get hounded out because nobody else is, but it is hard. And I'm struggling, and Steve knows it. I'm struggling with that right now. So that's my self-introduction. There's a lot of grassroots activity behind me. There's a whole lot of history, local, state, national history. How much is going to be there going forward for me and for what I think of as Rep, I don't know. But we shall see. If you're curious, rep.org is live. It doesn't have anything going on right now, but it's live. And there's a lot of history there. There's 25 years of history there with a lot of photos and a lot of writings and a lot of philosophical positions that I think need to be preserved, even if nothing else does. And also last summer, I started something different on my own, has nobody behind it. It's called greenelephantcoalition.org. And greenelephantcoalition.org is nothing but me and a few others. It has 3 interesting things on it. It has an endorsement of Joe Biden from last September. It has one page that documents extraordinarily well the Republican Party's history on environmental issues. Absolutely everything I could dig up that was any significance is on that website. It's a page called These Republicans Protected America. And then it has another page, which I recently changed to make it past tense, but it documents in excruciating detail all of the awful things that the Trump administration did. So it's a true comparison between all the Republican history in the past and the most recent administration. And that is green, not the, but greenelephantcoalition.org if you're curious. So that's my self-introduction, and I will be happy to answer questions too. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Martha. What an interesting history you have, and yeah, varied experience working on conservation efforts. So thanks for all your work. I did put links to both of those websites into the chat. So if folks want to check them out or copy and paste them for later, please do so. Yeah, so let's open it up for questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet. So if folks want to just unmute yourself and turn on your camera, feel free to ask questions that way. And if people are shy and quiet, I've got a couple of questions I can ask too.
This is Phil. I've got a few questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
So my first question is for Scott. And seeing that you're on the western slope and you're just down the highway a piece from our new elected Congresswoman, Lauren, is it Boebert?
Yeah, Lauren Boebert.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, do you foresee being able to work with her personally? But there also seems to be more and more Republicans who have that kind of in your face, go screw yourself kind of view for anyone who's not part of the base. Do you perceive her that way, or do you think she's someone that we can work with and kind of extrapolate? Because I mean, a lot of Republicans are going down that route, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think Martha spoke eloquently to, that there are those Republicans who, will engage on these issues with good faith, but that, especially as sort of reached its apogee in the Trump years, is the sort of type of strain in republicanism, the sort of Trump populism that really doesn't have any interest in engaging in anything bipartisan, because to engage in anything bipartisan is, sort of an anathema to how they build power among their populist base. And I'm afraid that Lauren Boebert is, a product of that environment and exists in that political marketplace. Jim, I know, has been an observer of her as well over the last few months during, this package of land bills moving forward in the House right now. But we can learn a few things from that. We've seen her officially oppose these bills. We've seen her, get involved in kind of a muscular way with amendments to oppose these bills. They're not good faith amendments to try to strengthen the bills. They're bad faith amendments, poison pills to try to, either score some political points or, hurt the overall process and prospects for the bill. So, I wish I could make a more hopeful note, Phil, to your question. But unfortunately, I feel like it's probably going to be pretty hard to work with her on any bipartisan opportunities. And, it's one of these things too, where like, I think we used to complain about Representative Tipton, but I'll say in his defense, we were able to work with him in 2014, 2015 on Hermosa Creek. And gosh, I don't feel very hopeful that the same kind of dynamics could come together with Congresswoman Boebert.
Okay. I'll open it up to other questions.
Thanks, Phil. Anybody else want to kind of chime in on Phil's question, Jim?
Yeah, I just briefly add a little bit to that, going back to the events of the last week and the amendments from Representative Boebert, which almost all of which were not ruled in order and it didn't get a vote on. And then the few that she co-sponsored were more like messaging opportunities to try to score political points with her base and went nowhere. But I just point out a fortunate side of this is, people in Western Colorado, I think many of them consider themselves conservationists. The annual State of the Rockies poll that comes out every year, it's like Christmas morning, I think the beginning of February, where we get new data on how people think about these issues. 2/3 of folks across the West consider themselves a conservationist. I know just from talking to folks that we work with all the time across Colorado, local officials, county commissioners, and municipal officials, people were really shocked that she put forward all those amendments and did not consult with them whatsoever and just totally wrote off their wishes and the long established work that has gone into crafting the Colorado Outdoor Recreation Economy Act in particular. So if anything, that's one nice thing. There's lots of different issues and they're all differently viewed through partisan lenses, but for public lands and conservation, there's widespread support from all kinds of folks on the ideological spectrum. And that's one piece of good news in the face of an otherwise challenging situation.
Yeah, I agree with that. Does sound positive.
Great, thanks, Jim. We've got a question in the chat. In your opinions, what are the broad categories, economic, ecological, recreation, etc., of arguments for wilderness areas that work in a bipartisan setting? Are there some of those that are stronger or weaker?
Anyone want to rock, paper, scissors for who goes first? Martha, do you want to take a first crack at this one since Scott and I already answered?
I would just say that land conservation, in my experience, has always been the one thing that Republicans respond to, I think, very well, and wildlife too. And even today, I think that's true. People relate to land. They relate to the natural places that they love. And I don't think you can ever go wrong hitting that theme, doing those things.
I would add that from my perspective and relatively brief experience in working on wilderness campaigns, the economic and recreation arguments seem to be taking a larger role of late. And you see that in polling data too, where just about everybody agrees that, you know, national public lands are good for the economy. They're helpful to have around. Most everybody participates in some kind of recreational opportunity, so people can relate to that and as a result support it.
Great, thanks. And Jay has got a question.
Thanks, Julie. Do any of the panelists have a position on the transfer of lands, of public lands, to tribal reservations federally recognized for conservation? And if so, could you tell us a little bit more about your position and why you have it?
I'm happy to go first on that one. The Wildlands project, which I would invite people to check out our website. It's cowildlands.org. You know, one of our first principles, you know, you can see on our website is, you know, the land, you know, quite, you know, which I think this is behind your question, is, you know, land that was taken, and the inhabitants were not given a choice. In this case, the Ute tribes. So I wouldn't say we have a position on specifically your question in terms of returning that land, but I do think we have a strong investment in the notion that tribal voices need to be much more deeply involved, and not just in the consultation that we've seen over the years where the land agencies will send like an obligatory letter to the tribes saying, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but actually a meaningful, you know, bringing of tribal voices into decision-making processes. And I think there's some really exciting opportunities that the issue of like Bears Ears in Utah has kicked open of, you know, opportunities to find ways of doing tribal co-management that really brings in more tribal involvement directly in management of lands. And I would hope that we can do that in Western Colorado, that we can find places and ways to do that, to bring the Utes to the table in co-management opportunities.
And I believe that there are some examples of instances where the Wilderness Society has supported the return of lands to tribes. I don't know them specifically off the top of my head, but I'm glad that Scott brought up the co-management approach as well, which just having tried to learn a little bit about that in the past year here, I think is an exciting opportunity to meaningfully do some good and to repair some of those past wrongs.
Great, thanks for that question, Jay. I've got another question in the chat. Do any of your organizations engage with the public comment process through NEPA? Are there any upcoming public comment periods for those of us on the Front Range that we should be excited about?
So in the job interview that brought me to the conservation world in Western Colorado, one of the first questions was, are you familiar with NEPA? And I had no idea. Welcome to the world of acronyms. But yes, we engage very closely in all kinds of NEPA public processes and comment periods. And I'm trying to think if there's any good ones for Front Rangers to engage in the near future. One of our big federal planning processes for a national forest here in Colorado should be kicking off sometime later this year, spring, summer, fall, for the Grand Mesa Uncompahgre Gunnison National Forest, about 3 million acres in Western Colorado. Not that close for us Front Rangers, but a beautiful, beautiful place. Yeah, I'll let others chime in if Scott or Martha want to answer that and try to think if there's any other good examples for opportunities for folks to weigh in on the Front Range.
I would just say that on that greenelephantcoalition.org website, there is a page about NEPA. And I wrote it specifically because most people have no idea what it is and how important it is and what an absolutely essential law it is, and why the Trump administration was so bound and determined to get rid of it. They did everything they could.
Yeah, I think I would just add that, you know, for BLM public lands in Colorado, you know, fortunately, the new administration came in and imposed a 60-day deadline on making any decisions. So it kind of like brought things to a halt. And so hopefully that'll give an opportunity for some of the maybe worse things that we're moving forward to have the brakes applied. And, you know, I think another thing that happened that is going to probably, it's not strictly speaking a NEPA process, but we're all going to need to probably speak up in defense of is this, the Biden administration's executive orders on climate contain a provision that have paused oil and gas leasing. And so, you know, while that program can be reviewed, which hasn't been reviewed in you know, decades, you know, and this is driven by climate in the case of this executive order, but there's also just a bunch of other issues related to that, such as, you know, energy companies sitting on, you know, stacks and stacks of unused and undeveloped leases that kind of tie up public lands and prevent other things from, you know, potentially happening, like conservation or recreation investments. And then, you know, the public might not be getting a very good deal in terms of royalties and, you know, the ways in which the federal government, you know, levies these corporations in exchange for using public resources like our natural gas and oil. So, you know, that's going to be facing challenges, I think, both political and legal. And there was going to be opportunities, I think, to defend that move while we review what's going on and while the administration hopefully makes a much more rational and much more climate appropriate policy for how to manage these natural resources. So I'd say look for that over the coming year or so as a way to be involved.
Yeah, and in the next kind of segment of this meeting, we'll talk about some of the other campaigns and projects that we're working on from the Denver group and then the statewide CMC conservation side of things. And some of them are NEPA related, some are you know, other types of advocacy and management processes. But yeah, we'll talk about those a bit more as well. We probably have time for one more question before we pivot to the next section. Anybody else? Phil, you have anything else for us?
Not right now.
Okay. Steve, any questions you wanted to close on?
No, I don't think so, other than to thank all three of the panel members for joining with us. I've known all of you for quite a few years. It's been, well, as the old Grateful Dead song used to say with the line, "What a long, strange ride it's been." And it's been a real pleasure working with all three of you. And I hope that continues for quite a few years. And so, since there are no other questions, if you guys want to hang around for the remainder of the meeting, that will be fine, or you can sign off whenever and I'll be in touch. Okay, and Julie, before we go on to you, we did pick up 3 more people. You already heard from Jay Collingham. That was a good question. Sue Austin, one of our regulars, is here. And Jenny Popovich, I think she's new to us, but she is the director of the Denver Group Backpack School. So welcome, Jenny. And Julie, I think let's turn it over to you for a little while for some statewide updates.
Okay, great. And yeah, thanks again for those great questions. You guys hit on most of the questions I was going to ask anyways. And thanks again to our speakers for taking time out of their evening to speak with us tonight. Give me 1 second and I'm gonna pivot and do just a real quick screen share. I can get my computer to cooperate here. Mostly because I would prefer people look at nice pictures than just look at my face. So. Okay, can you guys all see that? Awesome. Cool. So I'm just going to really quickly run through a couple of updates on some of the things that we're working on from the statewide conservation level. Some of them overlap with things that Steve and the Denver group are working on specifically, but hopefully I won't steal too much of his thunder with this. But I mentioned we're going to start with a little trivia. So if any of you are listening closely to Jim, how many acres of Colorado public lands are in the wilderness bill that passed through the House last week? So this is the Protecting America's Wilderness Act. How many acres of Colorado public lands in that package? You can throw it in the chat or shout it out if you know.
That's a good question.
So Sandy says 3 million. So in the total package, there are 3 million acres. And Christie's our winner. Yeah, there's about 1 million acres, a little over 1 million acres protected through kind of 2 bills that were then wrapped into this Protecting America's Wilderness Act. So the Colorado Wilderness Act is about 600,000 acres, mostly of BLM lands, and Scott spoke to this a little bit as well, but some really cool landscapes. Couple of 14ers, Handies and Red Cloud, and then some really neat canyon lands, a lot of different landscapes than we have protected. You know, we have a lot of rock and ice wilderness in Colorado, so high peaks, high alpine environments, and we've got more of our desert and canyons protected through the Colorado Wilderness Act. And then the Core Act is another 400,000 acres or so, and includes kind of 4 distinct packages around the state. A big one down in the San Juans that includes Mount Sneffels, some protections in the 10-mile range and areas in Breckenridge, in Summit and Eagle counties, and then Camp Hale as the nation's first potential national historic site. So some really cool landscapes, a lot of acreage, a lot of land, and a variety of protections, including both wilderness and special recreation and management areas, and different types of protections. So really cool. Great to see that pass through the House. It is on to the Senate, and we do have an action alert live right now, you know, to thank our House representatives that supported that movement, but also to urge our senators to really champion this on their side. And Bennett and Hickenlooper, you know, have both been supportive of this bill. Bennett's been a longtime champion of the Core Act for, you know, a number of years, but it doesn't hurt for them to hear from you just to solidify that support. So I just put a link in the chat if you want to check out the action alerts that we have live right now. You'll be able to comment and send letters to those representatives. Okay, so our next trivia question. This was based on some survey work that CMC did over the last month. Some of you may be familiar with the proposed state wildlife area pass that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is thinking about, and we've been working on this issue for, I don't know, 10 months or so, probably at this point. And so we did a survey and asked how much would you pay for an annual pass to these properties? There's about 350 state wildlife areas in the state. Any guesses on what we heard back from our constituents? 30 bucks?
I'm going to say 20.
Phil says 20. Okay, you guys are both basically right. Christy's really like on it with the wins tonight. About 58% of respondents said they would pay $30 or less. That was kind of the highest price point. So 30, 20, 10, you can see the colors represented there on the graph. Some people were willing to pay a little bit more. But we did hear also that people would be willing to pay more, $5 to $10 more, if they knew that the pass was going specifically to support wildlife conservation. And we, asked the question, what is the most important use of funds as we're generating these new dollars? And people overwhelmingly said habitat management and species conservation were the most important kind of things to protect. And granted, we've got potentially a demographic that is skewed towards supporting conservation efforts. But I think this survey and this data is really important to share with CPW, because our demographic is our, hikers and climbers are the people that are going to be paying for this pass. Other users of these areas that have a hunting or fishing license will not have to purchase this new recreation pass. So we're putting together comments. The CPW Commission is meeting in the middle of March, but you actually want to go ahead and comment by March 4th to make sure that your comments get included in their packet. So on that same action alerts page, we've got a SWA comment opportunity open, and really we're trying to get as many recreation voices, no matter what you think. Really, if you're willing to pay more, to pay $75 or $100 for a pass, you can feel free to put that in your comments, but we want CPW to be hearing from folks who are going to be purchasing this pass in the future. Okay, about a month and a half ago, CMC hosted our first ever Snow Ranger Summit, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what that actually entails. How many folks do you think attended our summit? And I'll qualify this by saying it was a virtual summit, so it was on Zoom. It wasn't in this nice snowy landscape that you see in the picture. How many folks did we have at the summit? Crickets. It was more than just me on Zoom all day, I promise. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and tell you. We had about 60 people on this Zoom call. We did it, so a few more than 10. Christy, you almost had 3 out of 3, but yeah, we had about 60 land managers, snow rangers, and people just kind of working in the realm of outdoor winter recreation attend the summit. It was an all-day, like 7-hour marathon Zoom meeting. And people popped in and out to talk about different program overviews, how these snow ranger programs run in different parts of the country. A lot of Colorado folks, but also people from Teton Pass and Mammoth Lakes out in California. And it was a really cool opportunity too to showcase the snow ranger program that CMC is running down on the Uray Ranger District, so down in the San Juans, in that Red Mountain Pass, Cimarron area. And our snow rangers are on. They started in early January, and they'll be on through April, assuming it snows ever again in Colorado. But they're doing some just really cool work. They use both snowmobiles and backcountry touring equipment to get to places where people are recreating. They do patrolling of wilderness boundaries to check for incursions from motorized use. They do a lot of just public outreach and education. So talking to people, asking them if they have their AVI safety equipment, if they've taken an avalanche course, if they know where they're going and have read the forecast for the day. And then they're doing some additional surveying, just getting a count of how many backcountry users they're seeing in different areas of the forest. So really cool program. If you haven't heard much about it, I'll put a link to their latest blog into the chat, and you can check out a little bit more, get a more detail about what they're up to. Cool. And then just a couple other quick updates on items we've talked about in the past with this group. We've mentioned the DeCalibron 14ers, Democrat, Lincoln, Cameron, and Bross in Park County near Alma. And we've been working with the private landowners there to figure out how we limit liability and help facilitate public access to those 14ers, which are actually private land. So we're continuing to do that work. We had a grad student produce a report at the end of 2020 with some recommendations to kind of convene a stakeholder group and bring together folks to continue talking and strategizing about kind of the next steps for potential legislative changes and that sort of thing. Along those same lines, and Steve may speak to this a little bit as well, we're looking at doing additional surveying at those 14ers. We had one of our staff, Connor, out at the Kite Lake Trailhead on a Saturday in August, I think, and he counted about 350 people, surveyed about 100 of them, and got some really cool information just about where they were from, how they got information about the peaks, whether or not they knew they were private land, and that Bras is technically closed. So we're going to be looking to replicate that and actually looking for volunteers to help us do some of that survey work and communicate with the public. So stay tuned for more information as we kind of roll that out into the summer. Steve mentioned Fisher's Peaks. This is Colorado's newest state park, which is down in the, well, south central, southeast-ish part of the state near Trinidad. They are just initiating kind of a stakeholder planning process to decide what it is they're going to do with this park, where they're going to put trails, where they're going to have, you know, camping and allow different types of public access. And so we're, you know, figuring out how to engage in that process and make sure our staff and our, you know, voice as CMC recreationists is represented in that process. Couple other things, our stewardship crews. I just got word on Friday that we've hired 2 full crews, so we'll have 6 seasonal folks coming on to do trail work across the state this year. And it was Jim or Scott mentioned the Great American Outdoors Act. I think it was Jim, that was passed last year, and CMC is actually going to be directly benefiting from that bill and the passage of those dollars and funding. So those flow through the agencies, through the Forest Service, and then the Forest Service contracts with CMC to put our trail crews on the ground to do backlog and deferred maintenance work on trails and recreation infrastructure. So kind of cool to see that happening. They're just starting to trickle down this year, and I think in 2022 and beyond, we'll see that even more. One really cool program that we also just got funding for from the State Trails Grant is for about a 3-mile reroute of the Colorado Trail. If folks are familiar with Foosa's Creek, it's near Salida, close to Monarch Pass and the Monarch Crest Trail. But we're going to be doing a big reroute, and our staffer Brink Messick is kind of the project lead for that. So he's doing all of the design, all of the construction management, hiring out some contract crews and that sort of thing to do that, starting this summer and into next year as well. And then last but absolutely not least, just a plug for our recreation impact monitoring system. We've got a mobile app where you can collect data on public lands. That's super helpful for land managers to understand both use and impacts from recreation. And we're going to be kind of launching a whole new process to sign up for specific trail monitoring work this summer. So keep an eye out for that. And right now we've really been spending a lot of time with land managers, getting them set up with access to the data from the back end. So we have these customized dashboards where they can go in, view the data, manipulate it, see it in charts and graphs and maps. And we're getting them set up with those dashboards before we really get into the summer season. So a lot of work in that realm, and I'm sure I missed something that we're working on, but those are the things I could come up with on a Monday. So happy to open it up for any questions. Sweet. Yeah, if nobody has any questions, I'll kick it back over to Steve, and feel free to pop something in the chat if anything comes to mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie. We're just about right on time, and we want to get into some local things. First off though, Julie mentioned the 14ers in Park County, and that is in the Denver Group Conservation Work Plan for this year. There are a couple of people on this call who have expressed interest in being involved with that. One is Jeremiah Hool, another is Elizabeth Morgan, and we've got a couple more. I've shared key information with them so far. I think we've got a total of 4 on that. And then what I'll need to be doing, Julie, is coordinating primarily with Connor as we get maybe toward the end of March to see where he's at and wanting to set up a rotation, and then our Denver group team can kind of step in and help out with that and recruit other people. And Jenny, since you're on the call, that's something that the backpack section might be interested in. And I'm now a member of that, so I can put stuff in your newsletter about conservation. And Linda Lawson was very inviting for that. In fact, if I hadn't suggested it to her, she probably would have recruited me. So since she's very interested in that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea, Steve. Absolutely. I'd also like to talk to you about how maybe we can get some of the backpacking students involved. So I'll talk to you offline, but.
Yeah, let's do that. And certainly, I've also talked with Uwe Sartori about the backpack section and conservation. He's the new chair. And we'll have a number of offline comments coming up, or offline commentary. If anyone else on this call wants to be engaged with this 14ers project, please drop me a note. It's climbersteveb@gmail.com. It's all over the web, or at least the CMC web, I should say. I don't want it on the dark web. Thank you. And always remember to include the letter B. Otherwise, your email will go to the other Climber Steve in England. And so let's get into some of our local reports very quickly. Jim Guerra is on the call tonight, I think. Yeah, he's still here. Jim, you want to give us a report on Douglas County? And if you want to talk a little bit about our Devil's Head meeting in the morning, feel free to include that also.
Okay, yeah, on that, the Devil's Head, this is going to be the third. I'm hoping we'll get into a little more substance. The first two meetings really were a little more high-level introductions and just high-level objectives. So I'm hoping to get into some more detail tomorrow. For a 3-hour meeting with the information they passed, I think there will be. Douglas County, our county commissioners did approve transferring conservation easements to Douglas Land Conservancy for a couple of properties, one of which is Sandstone Ranch. So that's a good thing, because having those easements and having them held in a separate organization is good. And then I think all the other stuff I just put in my monthly updates after our COSAC meeting.
Okay, any questions for Jim from among the group? Okay, and I do send those COSAC notes out. Jim is our lead contact for CMC in Douglas County. He's also a member of the Douglas County Open Space Advisory Committee. County commissioners appointed him to a 3-year term on that about, 11 months.
April last year.
And it's good to have somebody like that there. And Jim's been doing a fabulous job, not just for CMC, but primarily also for his constituents. And so
we're trying to get our sales tax, open space sales tax expire or sunsets end of 23. So one of the things we're waiting for the county commissioners to decide is this something we're going to put on the ballot this year? And one of the things that I think is interesting in light of the panelists earlier is this is a fairly conservative county. And, everybody I've talked to, and I do a lot of talking with people out in the public, this is truly, a bipartisan issue. This is one of those few things I think you could say that has broad bipartisan support in, open space and parks and recreation. So it's actually kind of nice in light of the partisan nature of the last few years to have, be in an area where it's truly bipartisan support. Everybody, is happy with what we've done, and hopefully that'll translate to, if it's on the ballot this year, hopefully it'll be extended.
Hey, anyone else want to weigh in on that for Douglas County or Devil's Head? And we do have a couple of other people on the Devil's Head team, Jennifer Shamp and Samantha Laux. Neither of them are available tomorrow, but we keep them on that list because we want their feedback.
Yeah.
And next, I don't have a whole lot to report on Jefferson County tonight. Both Shannon Campbell and Dave Litke were unable to be here. We are looking for 1 or 2 new people to step in on Jeffco. We lost Whitney Yeldell, who was very good for us, but she moved to Nederland and she's now doing most of her conservation work for the Boulder Group. So we're happy that she's still in the trenches with us, but she's doing it for a different club chapter right now. So if anyone's interested in learning about that, drop me a line and I'll put you in touch with Shannon and Dave. They basically run that on behalf of Denver Conservation, and they report to me, but I let them kind of run it the way they see fit, because they know what needs to be done and how to do it. In terms of a major project that's underway, the Outside 285, this is a project with regard to determining recreational opportunities in the 285 corridor, running from Conifer to Kenosha Pass and up to Geneva Basin and Guanella Pass. And I see Grover's on here now, so I'll let him talk on that in just a moment. But Outside 285 has a number of focus areas. They're now up to 7, a couple down by Buffalo Creek, one over by Roxborough, Waterton Canyon, Kenosha Pass itself, and also Geneva Basin, Guanella Pass. And Brink Messick has been the staff lead for that, and I've been seconding him, covering also when he's not available as the organizer for Denver Group. And Michael McMahon, who's on this call, and let's see, Sue Austin and Phil Cummer have been on the Outside 285 team and getting all the notes and materials, and also Grover. And today, Brink, Grover, and I met with one of the facilitators just to talk about hiker trails, hiker-only trails. And we were focusing mostly on Geneva Basin with a little on Buffalo Creek, which is down in the Buffalo Creek burn area that's south of Pine Junction. And south of the town of Pine, it's south of the Buck Snort Saloon in Spinks Park, if you're familiar with that. In non-COVID times, it's an interesting water hole, shall we say. Grover, you want to add anything? Are you tuned in? Yeah. I see his icon.
Okay, I think, you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, these evening Zoom meetings seem to elude me. I forgot until I saw one of your emails earlier in the day, and then I ran in here. We've been working on the 285, and the vast majority of the new trails proposed have been patrolled by mountain bikers. A lot of them are down in Buffalo Creek and up around Staunton. And I learned today, so I had proposed a new trail in Geneva Basin, 8-mile trail. And I thought that things looked good. It made it through the first filter. The Forest Service vetoed a lot of the projects, as did the wildlife folks, but this trail made it through and I was feeling pretty good about it. And then today I learned that maybe the wildlife people aren't so happy with it. It goes up Mill Gulch, which is kind of an area that's kind of undisturbed. And I think the wildlife folks kind of want to leave it that way. So I'm not sure what will happen. Other than that, there really are no other, somebody had proposed a trail up Long Scraggy, but there were problems with that. And it's a really, the mountain club goes up there quite a lot. There's social trails, and we thinking maybe just leave it the way it is. There's some falcons nesting up there, and if we try and make a official trail out of it, then they'll have to close it during certain seasons. Otherwise, it's just kind of informal the way it is now. So I don't really know whether we're going to get any hiking trails or not. I did say one of the problems I saw with the mountain bike trails is that they were really long and unsuitable for hiking unless they get some intermediate access points for hikers. Whether you like multiple use or not, you don't even have a chance if the darn trail, it takes you way out. So it requires a really long hike to get there. So I did tell them that. I guess they're kind of aware of it. And that's really all where we're at right now. I don't know whether this Mill Gulch trail that I proposed up in Geneva Basin will fly. I sure hope it does because it's a really neat trail, but we'll just have to see. I guess that's about all I have there.
Okay, thanks, Grover. And for Julie, for your information, also Sandy for Denver Group Council, one of the things we did talk about was just internally working with our Denver Safety and Leadership Committee, and Jim Guerra is on that, of making sure that leaders avoid long scraggy during nesting season, which is basically March 15th to the end of July. One of the downsides of going up there, as we joked about, was hikers might get dive bombed by falcons because they're pretty fast. But anyway, in seriousness, we'd want to protect that and make sure we keep access to that particular destination open for us. And let's see, one other thing I was going to mention on Jeffco, as of today, Deer Creek, Hildebrand Ranch, and Matthew Winters parks are all closed due to mud. And I'll get something into the club office tomorrow. And Jim, you might want to pass that on to Kevin Shaw if you'd like. That was just announced today.
Okay.
And so that'll be one less person I need to pass it on to. So I'll just let the office staff know. And let's see. Two final things, and then we'll go back to Julie for any last comments. Our next meeting is on Monday, June 7th. We don't have a speaker right now, and I'd like to toss that open to folks on this call as well as others. If you have any ideas, please let me know. And, you know, one that just came to mind, Julie, we might invite John Reiber to be a speaker, as he did talk last year, but maybe some updates, but we'll figure that out. And also I've talked with Julie about something. I just passed it on to Sandy today about making some changes in our organization. Phil and Grover, you just got the first glimpse of that today. Going into our written charter, that's our governing document, replacing a couple of organizers at the top with a steering committee. And a steering committee of 7 to 9 people, which would allow more people to get involved in managing this program, and also more people to give feedback up into the statewide Conservation Advisory Council, because we're limited in the number of Denver people we can have on that. Since we don't want to, since we're the biggest chapter with over half the membership, we'd flood other people out. Right now, Phil and I are the representatives on that. But anyway, the idea of a steering committee, which we want to start thinking about. And Sandy, I just did send that to you today before this meeting with a report for the March council meeting. So Phil or Grover, you want to add any last things, or Jim?
Nope.
No,
Okay, that's everything I have for tonight. And we said we'd be done by 8 o'clock, and it's 7:58. So Julie, you want to say anything final and then wrap things up for us?
Yeah, great timing, Steve. Yeah, just thanks, Steve, for putting this together, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your evening to join us. We have been recording, so we'll make this available if you missed any part of it, or if you want to share it with folks that weren't able to be here tonight. So yeah, thanks for your time, and we'll see you all in a few months, hopefully sooner than that, but a few months at the latest.
All right. Good meeting. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, everyone.